Um, yeah, so because what I wanted to do was have this be yeah, it's some general history of Montpelier, but I wanted to have it be particular to the site as well that we're going to be working on. So, but what we're going to talk about tonight is give you some background history of Montpelier, talk a little bit about what we're doing in our current project with looking at sites of labor, and also get you set up to understand some of the areas you're going to be seeing and what kind of the theme of these expeditions that we do. And hello, Webster, how are you? Good to see you. Glad you made it.
Thank you.
And what we're going to be doing, what I wanted to do tonight is to start out by asking you what comes to mind when I say power of place. This is, there's not one definition for this. The National Trust for Historic Preservation has this as a motto, power of place. And when you think about, a historic property like Montpelier, what comes to mind?
The influence a place has on the person and why they cited their life there.
Yeah, and you said why they spent their life there, or how they spent their life there,
or why they chose that place to settle and to stay.
Yeah, and that's actually a question that we as archaeologists ask all the time, is like, why did someone choose this spot? Like, everything from why did James Madison's great grandfather choose this particular part of the Virginia Piedmont to patent? Was it the location near a river system? Was it the land, the suitability of the soil to agriculture? Was it, a place where he had political connections and the family had political connections for improving roads? And then everything drilling all the way down to why did a member of the enslaved community, first, did they have the choice? Or if they did have the choice, why did they build their home in a particular spot on the landscape? Was it because it was located near a spring at the top of the hill, protected off the edge? So these are all questions that we look at and that definitely that is a huge power of place from the past. So, and hello, Kate and Jack, how are you all doing? Good to see you all. What else comes to mind with power of place? What about for the present?
What about for the what did you say?
What about for the present day? Yeah, I should have been more specific. What about for the present day? Like, when you visit a historic site like Montpelier.
Would you mind repeating the entire question?
Oh,
Sorry.
sure, Kate. It's asking, what comes to mind when I say, when you think about power of place? And in this case, it's what comes to mind when you think about visiting a historic site like Montpelier today, like y'all are going to be doing next week?
I think some of it for me is, even though it might be 200 or 300 years old, which for the US is old, it still means a lot. There's still a lot there that is important for us to remember and to use in our lives.
Wow, so that's really meta, Jane, in terms of like, pulling it all the way up, that 10,000 foot view of, what happened, for example, at Montpelier. I can see what you mean. I was just writing about this today for a statement that I was writing, that what happened there in the past has an impact on us today. And that makes visiting Montpelier, a place like Montpelier where, Madison, not only did he write the Virginia Plan that became the basis for the Constitution, but it was where he was formed as a person. When he was your age, Jack, you're 13. When he was your age and he, witnessed that, at that point, his grandmother had just passed away, but we're going to talk about in a second, you know, that his grandmother was running one part of the plantation for much of his life, and his parents were running another part of the plantation. The grandmother was having her slaves grow tobacco and export it to England. And then his parents, where his parents' house was, the planter's cottage, as we call it, they had their slaves serving the needs of the local community in terms of having a mercantile store and selling goods, importing goods from England and selling it to local farmers, having a massive blacksmith shop where they were producing wagons and plows. And so all this formed who Madison was and his understanding of what freedom was, what personal property was, which is people, which is, you know, an aspect of slavery that is absolutely horrific. And also what, you know, individual liberties meant. So for the founding fathers, individual liberties might have to do with the right to own slaves as property. And that is a very different concept of individual liberties. In fact, I would dare say, we'd all say that's the opposite of what we think of individual liberties today. You know, it's, you know, the ability to have, you know, property, you know, life and happiness. That's the, so things change and the landscape is part of that, you know, what's on that landscape. So what I wanted to do is we're going to dive back into the past here and look at, you know, some of the history. I want to give a snapshot of the history. What I want to do is give you all enough familiarity with the history of Montpelier so that when you're here next week, you'll have an understanding of how the site you're looking at, say like the temple over by the main house or the South Yard, fits into the larger landscape, but then also the larger history. So I think Melissa has probably sent you a number of documents, PDFs that go over the history of Montpelier. Y'all have gotten those. I see, Jack, you're nodding your head vigorously. So you've read them all, Jack?
Well, I have.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, you both can talk about it on the way here. So you're in Washington, D.C., so you'll have a little bit of a drive.
Yeah, no big deal.
Like an hour and a half. But yeah, what I'll do is I will go ahead and share screens right now and get the PowerPoint up here. And let me find you all again so I can have you all on my screen as well. So you're all over on my left-hand side. So you can see the screen here. Everybody good?
Yes.
All right.
Yep.
And like I said in this PowerPoint, want to give a really, you know, basic overview of the history of Montpelier and also put in context what we're doing right now with our current project. You know, Montpelier, as you'll see it this upcoming week, what is the centerpiece that most people expect to see is the restored main house. And so that we restored the main house back and we completed that restoration in 2008. Talk a little bit about that today. And what we're doing is restoring the landscape to not only have visitors to be able to imagine and understand what, you know, Mr. Madison's house looked like, but also the surrounding landscape, for which really was the purview of the enslaved community, the enslaved Americans that lived here from the 1720s all the way into the 1844 when Dolly sold the slaves at that point. And pretty much we were in a session last night with the Montpelier Descendant Committee, staff was, and our metal detectorist, you know, said, you know, one thing that meant the most to him in working with the descendant community is that, you know, the thousands of artifacts he's found in metal detector survey to locate the sites that are on the 2,700 acres that make up Montpelier. And this is a map of Montpelier. The white line is the property that makes up Montpelier today. He said that, you know, found tens of thousands of artifacts and he can only identify 2 that might have belonged to the Madisons. Everything else was an item that was either produced, owned, or, you know, used by the enslaved community. So, and when you look at the ratio, there were about, at any one time, there was about 120 enslaved Americans at Montpelier to around about 7 to 8 to 9 free people. And most of those were members of the Madison family, but there was an overseer at Montpelier in his household. At any one time, there could be, there were artisans who were training slaves, especially with the renovations that happened to the main house in the 1800s and 18 teens. And so in looking at this, what we've done through the years is, most of the sites we've done excavations on are domestic sites. And that's actually the site we're going to be excavating this next week is a slave quarter. But the classic sites that we'll talk more about this, and you're going to see even more details when you're at the site next week, when we walk through the South Yard, is kind of the classic thing that you think about on a historical dig is, excavating a house where there's like the chimney bases right here. You've got post holes for a porch, and then lots and lots of artifacts that go with that. And for the South Yard, what we've done is we use this archaeological evidence to restore the South Yard to what it looked like back in the day. And we'll explore this early next week. One of the other sites that we excavated that was very different was the quarters for the home farm. And actually, we're working all throughout this area right now. This is a shot from about 2012 when we were excavating the homes that were here. And where the subfloor pit is, we found, this is the location of a building. But at all these sites, what we find is lots and lots of artifacts, ceramics, glasswares like this wine bottle glass, sometimes tobacco pipes like this Colonaware pipe that we found at Mount Pleasant during my, the first year I was here in 2000. And these artifacts not only give us an idea of what, in this case, the slaves owned in their households, but also it makes it really, I won't say really easy, but it makes it much more easy to locate these sites through survey, because where you have these broken ceramics and glass and animal bone that's thrown down slope, you get this scatter that when you dig the little shovel test pits that we dig, and I'll show a picture of this in a few slides, we screen the dirt that comes from that and we find the artifacts. Or in the case of Dennis, he uses his metal detector and finds these things. Now, what we're also interested in is not just the places where the enslaved lived, because there were a lot more buildings where they worked. There's everything from storage sheds. In this case, this is not just a storage shed, but also the appearance of what one of the tobacco barns would look like. There's granaries, stables, any number of structures. And we'll talk more about this when we talk about the field quarter or the home farm. And at these sites, the most predominant artifact at these types of buildings is nails. And when you're using a metal detector survey, that's what you're most likely to find. But they're in smaller concentrations, and really metal detector survey is the only way to locate these buildings. And we'll talk about how we use those metal detector surveys in a minute. But what we also do is use LiDAR to locate, where the fields are. And I don't know if you all got the examples of the LiDAR we've done in the East Woods for the sites of labor. This is where these drainage trenches were. I'm not sure, was that in the reading packet? Is a story map, as a web map?
I don't remember it.
Yeah, I don't remember seeing that.
All right, when I send the video link, I'll make sure to put that in the email to this, and you all get this. You all get this as well. And I am just looking for my notebook, which I don't see. But anyways, I'll make a note right here for that. So the East Woods and Home Farm. So with all this, these sites that aren't living sites, but they're sites where labor takes place, these are what we call sites of labor. And so these sites of labor are literally where the slaves are doing the work that produced the wealth for the Madisons. And in what the Montpelier descendant community is interested in with these sites of labor is, not just these being the witness sites for the labor that was extracted from their ancestors, But also they've asked us to look at these sites to understand what the intellectual contributions of their ancestors were. I mean, the enslaved who were working at this at Montpelier, they had a community that was here from the 1720s all the way up until 1844 when the plantation was sold. And so you've got 5 generations of individuals, all of whom were doing work on the plantation and would have not only learned from their own work about what kind of soil works best with tobacco and how erosion takes away certain types of soils and certain slopes. Not only would they have learned that with their own work and their own lives, but when you have a community that's in a location like Montpelier for generations, there's generational knowledge that's passed on. People know where the best patch of blackberries are, from their grandparents when they're out there, on the Sunday or in the evening when they do have time to gather food for themselves. They'll know where the best patch is to grow sweet potatoes, and this knowledge is in people's heads. And the folks that are really organizing the landscape for where to plant the crops would have been the enslaved community. And even, there's evidence at Montpelier in the documentary records that the enslaved individuals were overseers. And so they had charge in designing the workday. And so for these enslaved Americans, for, the Madisons, when they were considering who to sell if they had debts to make up, if you're an individual who's just brute labor, your contributions are going to be fairly limited to the labor you're assigned to. But if you're, one of the enslaved individuals that knows how to hang the tobacco in the tobacco barn, what temperature when you're heat curing tobacco to get to that sweet spot to make that sweet tobacco, the sugar come out of the tobacco, and when it's going to be too dry, if Madison sells you, he knows and that all that information is going. That's leaving the property, not just your labor, but that intellectual capital is going to be gone. And so you potentially have some leverage. And this is the kind of questions that the descendant community has really pushed us to ask. And we'll talk a lot about that, working with descendants and how this has influenced the kind of sites that we're looking at. So and so for us, these sites are important. One, you can imagine, when you come to a plantation, what do you think of when you think of a plantation? What kind of buildings do you think would be there?
Barns.
Yeah, barns, absolutely. What's that, Jack?
Warehouses.
Oh yeah, absolutely, warehouses, because you're going to store the crops, like granaries and tobacco press houses. You're going to store these crops once they're packed for the right time to bring it to market. And then also you're going to need storehouses for, keeping tools and keeping supplies for the year, because you can't just run down to Food Lion and pick up more food. You're going to have to store these items. So yeah, all this, we want to find all these to restore them all for full-scale restoration. And also, one thing we've got at Montpelier is, unfortunately, a lack of documentary records. What happens in the 1850s when Madison's stepson, John Payne Todd, he was the son of Dolly from her first marriage. When he dies, the plantation's already sold, and he's living in the neighboring town of Gordonsville at a place called Toddsworth, his home. And Madison's nieces and nephews literally find 2 rooms full of documents when they visit his house. And they decide that, all these documents potentially have scandal from John Payne Todd's gambling debts, because Madison was constantly, getting him out of debtor's prison. And also they decide that Uncle Jimmy was this is President Madison, his nieces and nephews decide he was an incredibly private man who wouldn't want people or history prying into his family business, which was slavery. So they haul all these documents out to the back lawn, take a few scraps, and put a match to the rest and burn them. So with that goes maps showing where fields are, lists of slaves and allocation of items to them, all the information that when you visit Monticello, all those records are there because Jefferson was an intensive note taker and had all these things archived. So what we've got at Montpelier is a set of archaeological records that is unparalleled. And this comes from some of the history of Montpelier. You know, Madison's owned the property from 1723 up until 1844. After 1844, there's essentially 2 centuries of preservation. When Dolly sells the property and sells all the enslaved community, Montpelier never returns to being an operation of over 100 slaves. It's around 25 slaves, so a lot of the fields are abandoned. And then when you go into the Civil War, the plantation goes into further decline. And finally, when the DuPonts buy the land in 1901, they don't need to make money off the farming the fields when really the production picks up at Montpelier. They are basically focusing on making Montpelier into a hobby farm. And so all these fields that have been abandoned in the 1840s, some have returned to woods, others remained in pasture, like where you're going to be working next week. A lot of them were never even plowed. So we've got this fantastic preservation. And what this allows us to do is to understand, you know, and find these sites. So here's the 2,700 acres right here. The visitor core is right in the middle. There's the visitor center right here. Here's the main house. Where you all are going to be working is in this area right here. This is where the farm complex is. And we'll go back to this and I'll show you some more detailed maps of this area. You'll also be visiting the Gilmore cabin on the other side as well as the Civil War camps. And are any of you all staying in Arlington House or are you all staying in the village?
I'm staying at the Arlington House.
You're staying at the Arlington House. Okay. Arlington is right over here off of Route 20. So when you all come in, when you come, well, actually for all of you all, you're going to see Arlington on Sunday. You're going to come down Route 20, make a left onto Jacksontown Road and go over the railroad bridge. This is the railroad right here. And then make an immediate right, go up the driveway, and that's Arlington. For those, if anybody's staying in the village on the property, that's over on this side of the property. And for both of y'all, I think Melissa sent you maps for all that. But for the property, what was the originally during the Madison era, the area that's in yellow is what was owned by the Madison family. These additional areas up here and over here were added to the plantation boundaries in around 1901 to 1908 by the DuPonts. And I'm going to include the plantation blog that I wrote earlier last year about these shifting boundaries. And then what we've done, you know, what we've got on the landscape is about 1,800 acres of woods. Of this, only about 400 acres were wooded back in the Madison era. The rest were fields. And what we've done today is done metal detector surveys. And this, I'm going to go over this in more detail in a minute, but these areas where you have this grid of squares here, here, over in this area and here, the green is low concentration of hits. The red is a higher concentration. And do you all remember seeing any of these maps in the background materials I sent you?
Mhm. Yes, yep.
Look a little familiar? Okay, great. So, but this is how we locate these sites with metal detector surveys. And, you know, we found hundreds of sites across the property. And what these do is document the history of the landscape use through time. So, you know, starting out in the early, you know, for the first generation of Madisons, we've got Mount Pleasant, which is the original home site, owned by and operated by Francis Madison. And I'll go ahead and send you an article that Chris and I just wrote on Francis Madison that goes over some of this history. But for what we're looking at during this time period is when tobacco is being grown for the most part. That's the dominant export crop. And it's a very intensive crop. It takes the nutrients out of the soils. And by the time you get to the 1760s, when James Madison is about 12 years old, actually about your age, Jack, his grandmother has died, and his parents are starting to take over the operation of the estate. They, when they were first married in 1749 or 1748, they have a small cottage built up by where the main house is. And it's like about 16 years later that they build the main house after the grandmother dies. And so by the time this main house is built, what James Madison's parents are having their slaves involved in is more plow-based agriculture. They're planting grains and also have established this blacksmith operation I was talking about, which is over by the temple, which is over in this direction. Now, this is pretty much how the plantation is run up until James Madison Jr. is married to Dolly Madison in 1797, and he begins taking over the operation of the plantation. At that time, the house changes from this Georgian manse with the two chimneys marking the ends. There's an addition put on the end right here as a duplex, and then of course the front portico is added. And so Dolly and James are in this side of the house. The parents are still in this side up until 1801, and that's when James Madison's father dies. But it's also when James Madison becomes Secretary of State. And it's at this time that he starts to really have his slaves and overseers experiment with scientific farming. And the farm complex that we're studying right now, and you're going to be seeing, getting detailed tours and doing excavations on next week, is a site that he has his overseers developed during this early 1800s time period. And all this is anticipation of James and Dolly's eventual retirement, which finally happens in 1817. So 2 terms as Secretary of State, 2 terms of president. And in 1808, what they start to do is start to make changes to the house. They go from, this 2-story block and all these outbuildings in front of the house to basically taking down all the buildings in front of the house, adding on these 1-story wings, and then creating this larger picturesque landscape. So where the blacksmith shop was over here, of the parents' generation, and which was run by Moses, the head blacksmith, that's taken away. A decorative temple is built. There's a pine alley put in place, this grove of trees over here. And this is the landscape that the Madisons used for all the entertaining they did during the retirement years. And as they get up in years, when James Madison passes away in 1836, this is when Dolly moves back to Washington, D.C. And she basically turns the plantation over to her son, John Payne Todd. He starts selling off slaves, as she was as well. It gets further into debt. And by 1844, Dolly decides to sell the entire estate, lock, stock, and barrel. And about 4 years after that, basically all the buildings except for the main house and temple that are from the Madison era are taken down. So basically you get, by the time of the Civil War, you've got this landscape where not only all the buildings are taken around the house, but when you look at the map for the property of the time period, here's the main house right here. The farm complex we're looking at is right in this area. All this production area right here by 1850 shifts to over where the lab is today. And all this area is completely abandoned. And so that means that, all these sites, the barns, the slave quarters, basically are left to decay in the ground, and the archaeological sites are left completely intact. So what's great about the sites you're all going to be working on is when you find a nail or a ceramic sherd in the ground, based on the landscape history, it dates from the period of Madison ownership. So it's dating to before 1844. So this is incredibly helpful for these sites, because if they were continued to be occupied up until like say the 1920s, you would have late 19th century and 20th century deposits mixed in to all these Madison era deposits, and sorting through that would be pretty difficult. In fact, usually what happens at these sites is the earlier deposits get scraped away and these later deposits are dominant. So the latest deposits we have here are from the 1820s and 30s. So we got this perfect set of sites to understand what was here and begin to reconstruct this landscape. So moving on through time, one period you're going to learn about is the Civil War at Montpelier. There were Civil War encampments at Montpelier. There was, at any one time, there was about 1,200 troops encamped at Montpelier. And so these camps on the property, on this map, they're marked in gray throughout this area. We've got summer camps that are up in these upper ridges, which are, occupied after Gettysburg, but before November of 1863. And then the sites that you're going to see on a tour is a set of sites. These are these winter encampments occupied by South Carolina troops that Chris will take you out to, where we've actually worked with reenactors to rebuild some of these huts. And this is actually a 15-year-old picture. Yeah, this is, 12-year-old picture now. We've actually rebuilt these through some of the log cabin programs that we did about 2 years ago before COVID hit. So with this, during the Civil War and up until the DuPont's purchasing the property, not a lot of changes happened to the landscape, but the house changes dramatically. In addition, this is, the post-emancipation period is where we get several former slaves of the Madisons that settle on the property and build a cabin, the Gilmore cabin being one that we've restored today to its 1880s appearance. And leading up to 1901, really the plantation goes into further decline. There's, not a lot of agricultural activity and a lot of sites to remain preserved. And when the DuPonts buy the property in 1901, this is when they radically expand the size of the house. This is what the house looked like when I started in 2000. And it's really dramatic from this back shot right here. This is what the house looked like in 1901. Notice the back porch, this colonnade, sticking off the house. By 1905, that colonnade is sucked into where all these additions are. So you can see the colonnade right there. And then these wings are added onto the house that make the house 3 times its size. And so with this, there's a lot of changes to the house, but the landscape, the changes that happen in the landscape are confined to a very small area, which was the farm complex from the 1850s and onward that continues to be developed by the DuPonts. But all the rest of the old Madison farm complex is left alone during this time period. So we've just got, we've got an amazing set of buildings where the lab is. That's where I'm sitting right now in my office right now, which is a building that was built in 1901 and was what was called the Fruit and Nut House. So it's where they dried fruit and nuts, and then later it was changed into a residence in the 1920s. To what the house looked like back in 2000 when they started was this. By 2002, we had gotten a gift from the Mellon family to take off the DuPont wings. The wings were built by the DuPont family. And this, this was one of the most intensive restorations for any of the founding fathers that had ever happened. And still to this day is a very intense restoration project that we did. We spent 6 years carefully removing the DuPont additions and then finally got back to the Madison house. And what we discovered is that so many of the windows from what we thought were from the DuPont period were actually from the Madison period. And this is especially true on the back of the house. You can see these 6/6 windows right here. These were windows that were removed from the Madison house to the back of the house when the house was tripled in size in the 1905 period. So when we did this restoration, we basically carefully removed all these elements like an archaeological puzzle, and in many cases we're able to find where they went back. And right now we're actually doing a project that you might have seen in some of the Lunch and Learns if y'all have tuned into those. And we've got the website for the Lunch and Learns. I'll send you the link to the Lunch and Learn website. I'm glad I'm making a list for all this. You're going to have even more reading materials when you're done with me today. And don't worry, there's not going to be a test. You don't have to go through all this stuff. There's a lot of them are videos you can watch as well. So different learning modes. But we're actually digitizing all this research we did in the main house into a 3D model, a GIS model for the house. And we're on Thursday, we're going to give you I'm going to do a short lecture talking about this project and give you a chance to do some of the data entry of older unit records into GIS. And this is a project that's funded by the Institute for Museum Library Services. And if anybody's interested, we've got an online project where you can enter in old stratum cards from excavation units, such as what we did in the front yard in 2006. So in 2006, what we shifted our excavations from was all the excavations we did under the portico and in the basement to the front yard to figure out whether this painting that was done by Baroness Hyde de Neuville in 1817 had any reality on the landscape. And boy, did we find it did. We found the complete fence line that she had shown in this illustration. And these took the form of these post holes. What one of the staff archaeologists is pointing to right here, if you pointed the camera right into this hole, this is what you'd see. This post hole with a post that has charred edges. And it was the slaves charred these posts to harden them from insect infestation. But what that produces when you char any kind of organic material and it doesn't turn into ash, like if you throw a bunch of raspberry seeds or a corn cob that's still wet into the fire, it doesn't burn up. It basically carbonizes. And that carbon item lasts in the archaeological record. So if somebody buries a burnt corn cob in soil deposits 5,000 years ago, that corn cob will be perfectly preserved. And we're actually able to send the charred wood from these posts, just the outside skin that was charred, to a paleobotanist. And she was able to identify that the front fence that we were able to figure out where it was located was made up of black locust and black walnut. And we use that same wood for restoring the fence. And what we also found were wagon ruts out in front of the house. These are the last set of wagon ruts that are cut into the road before the grade was cut down in front of the house, and all this was filled by about a foot of soil. So we literally found where this wagon road was in front of the house. And then we used this information to restore the front of the house to what it looked like in the Madison era. And then we've done this same type of restoration all across the front, all across the main house. We spent the last 20 years from about 2000 until about 2019 doing excavations, from what we call the Boxwood Grotto all the way over to the temple, and figured out what this front fence looked like. We did excavations at the temple, at the Pine Alley to figure out the pine trees, the grove, also even in a downslope trash deposit, we found a massive set of porcelains and Chinese export items that showed what the Madisons had at the dining room table. The back lawn, we excavated for an underground bunker that we installed and figured out how not only did Madison have his slaves level out the back lawn, but the garden was also terraced by slaves in the 18 teens. So a massive amount of soil was maneuvered to create this picturesque landscape that the Madisons would have entertained. Like when the Marquis de Lafayette visits in 1825, this is the landscape that he and his guests would have seen. And then right in the middle of it, what you've got is the South Yard, which is the quarters for house slaves. And with the South Yard, we were able to figure out its location first from an insurance map from 1837. And then following that, we did excavations of what turned out to be a set of duplex buildings that looked something like this. And if any of y'all visited, between 2011 and 2014, we had these timber frame buildings out here. And when we visit the South Yard on Tuesday, I'll talk about the process of going from the archaeology of everything from finding the smokehouses to excavating the kitchen site, which turns out to be the original home of James Madison's parents, to the north dwelling, which was a spinning cottage, and then the process of working with descendants to not only do the archaeology of these spaces, but then also to figure out how to interpret these areas. And so this work we did with the descendant community is what ended up producing an exhibit we call the Mere Distinction of Color that you all will see on, I believe you all are going to tour that with Mary on Monday. But one of the things the descendants asked us to look at in the process of doing the work on, in the South Yard during those excavations of 2014 through 2019 was where most of their ancestors worked, which wasn't the main house, but was out in the fields. And for this, when we built the visitor center, we knew there were sites in this area from surveys we had done. And starting in 2016, at the request of the descendants, we sent Dennis out to do metal detector surveys. And what he found was a whole array of sites out here that some of which were located earlier, by us through excavations like the slave quarters, but the ones that are in red were ones that we needed to do metal detector surveys to find. And how these metal detector surveys work is, this is the map I showed earlier of the property. And these squares that are green and red and orange relate to the hit counts you can see right here. So what happens is we grid the property off on 20-meter grids, and then the metal detectors come out and swing their machines listening for hits. And you'll be able to see Dennis doing this when you're out here next week. Where they find hits, they sample them and see whether it's a wire nail, a gum wrapper, or a 19th century cut nail. And these nails are what we use to date the sites we find through metal detector survey. And Mary's going to go into some of the dating of the nails, but these nails and this illustration, have you all seen this illustration before? Does that look familiar?
No. No.
Like you covered in the story maps I'll send, this illustration is in there. And what can you imagine we can do with this dating information with nails that we find at a site? What does that do for us?
Well, it dates the site.
Yeah. And what does it date the site? What does it mean about, if you find a building that burned and they're all of these, like these machine cut side pinch nails, what does it mean about the date for that site? Like, can you say that it dates to before 1808?
No.
Yeah, it would be after 1808.
Right.
So
Right.
what it gives us is a terminus post quem. So it's kind of like, if we were digging a trash deposit and we found at the very bottom a penny that dated to say 1920, what would it say about that trash deposit if that penny had been deposited before all the trash was put in place?
So it's 1920 age and everything else is older.
Yeah, exactly. And so the penny was made in 1928, but it could have been deposited, who knows when. I mean, I've got a jar full of coins on my desk that probably go from 1985 all the way up until 2020. And so if I put some of those coins in my pocket and one of them drops into a hole, it doesn't mean that it was dropped in the hole in 1985. The only thing you can tell about it is it was dropped in there after 1985. One of the cool things about these nails is, though, when you look at these for a construction site, these nails are going to date to, especially these nails right here that date to the 1797 through 1808 period, has a very tight date range. For the addition that goes on the house, this 1797 edition, we can date it pretty much exactly to this period between 1797 and 1808, because when the wings go on, the next manufacturing type are these machine cut side pinch nails, and these dominate, what you can buy at market by that time. So the nails essentially date when these buildings were built. And what we're able to do with this is, when you look at, if you look at the detail of this area where the home farm is, this map right here blown up and blow it up again. Here's the visitor center. Here's the main house up here. This area right here, we've got about 3 different dating time periods. You've got the Mount Pleasant site with all the handmade nails, the tobacco barn with nails dating to the 1790s, And then everything else, including the slave quarter we'll be excavating next week, has nails that are machine cut nails that date to the 18 teens to the 1840s. And so with the 20-meter survey, and all these are these 20-meter grids. This is 20 meters by 20 meters. And what that 20 meters looks like in the landscape is about like this. With a 20-meter grid, what this shows is where a site is, and you know that there's stuff in this area. To actually define where buildings are and where one site ends and another site begins, say in the case of Mount Pleasant right in this area that dates to the 1760s, and the overseer's house that dates to the 1820s, what we do is we go back in and do a 10-foot grid and map the whole area all over again on a finer interval. And all of a sudden, for example, what looked to be a giant blob in here on the 20-meter grid gets more refined. So it's like taking your pixel size and making it finer. You get a better picture of where the concentrations are. And in this case, we're able to identify not only is there the overseer's house site right here, but there's a blacksmith site right here. And so we've done this all over this area, and we're still working on this. Actually, since I did this map about 2 weeks ago, Dennis has added even more grid to this area right here. And we're going to be basically filling in grid all across this area. We got a little greedy and put in grid where we've got the concentrations, and now we got to fill in these low areas in here. So if you look at this map right here, you can see these lower concentrations of green we've avoided, but there's still some patches in between we need to fill in. So there's a lot of work that we need to do. But what this has allowed us to do is with the metal detector survey, which goes pretty quick, is we've been able to figure out where these sites are. And we worked with the University of Arkansas, their Center for Advanced Spatial Technology. They developed a 3D model in essentially AutoCAD of what this space looked like. And so, you go from the metal detector surveys and the modern landscape to what this looked like back in the day. And this is what you're going to explore with Chris first thing on Monday morning. We're going to meet where the visitor center is today, location of the present day visitor center, and he's going to give you a walk-in tour. And then we're going to come back and begin excavations at the slave quarter site up here. So this is a shot of the overall area. And what I wanted to quickly go through is over the past year or so, we've done excavations at the overseer's house site, found where that building is, that we found a brick chimney base over here. The blacksmith shop, we began at this time last year, and at that site found a massive amount of blacksmith deposits and found a brick feature for the forge of the blacksmith shop. And here's more of these items. Just this area was loaded with slag and all this, clipped iron. And then the other site we found was a farrier's shop down the hill that is another blacksmith shop where we located what we think is a water-powered bellows based on a lead pipe we found. And this, again, has lots of artifacts, but a lot more horseshoe nails. And what I'll also do is we just did a lunch and learn today where our staff interns did a 5-minute summary of all these sites. So that's a really good overview. I'll send you the lunch and learn page, and then also we've got well, you don't need a video tour of the site because you're going to see all this next week. So we'll send you the lunch and learn there that goes over the analysis of this. And the final site we looked at was the Burns site, which turns out to be a tobacco barn located up on the hill here. And then finally, what we're looking at next is this site up here, which is a slave quarter. And just recently, we've dug shovel test pits all across this area. So this is looking down where the farrier site is. Slave quarters are up here. Blacksmith and overseers are behind Dennis right here, way over in this area. So Dennis is swinging his metal detector. This is Lizzie and Jennifer digging shovel test pits, these little round holes in the ground. And these shovel test pits, this is a map of where Lizzie and Jennifer were digging just last week. And this shows the concentrations of from low to high of all the ceramics we've been finding in this area. And then this map that goes the light brown to dark brown shows the concentration of metal detector hits. And so we've used this map to figure out where to place units for you all next week. And so what you all are going to be involved in next week is helping, working side by side with staff, excavating in these 5x5 units and, figuring out what's at this slave quarter site. Do we have the location of a building, where the trash deposits are, where the yard is? And hopefully by the end of the week, maybe finding foundations like we found at the blacksmith shop. But that's the overview of what we're going to be doing. Do any of y'all have questions about any of this? And this was kind of a whirlwind tour of all these sites. Now I'll give you a minute to breathe after all that. I know I need to breathe. So
I
Who's
can't
passing?
remember why they abandoned that one side and moved to the other, the subsequent generations. Was the land used up, or?
yeah, that is a question that we have wondered for a long time. We're thinking that the site with all these abandoned buildings just wasn't suitable for the different farm complex they wanted to build. The area down here, it doesn't quite make sense because there's a quite a large blacksmith shop that was over there. And it really makes us wonder if somehow some of these sites were destroyed or taken down by certain owners. It's unfortunately a mystery that, we're hoping that we'll be able to figure out the dates for when all these sites were destroyed or abandoned rather, and then taken down. And that might tell us about it. But yeah, we're still trying to figure that out. All we know is we're glad it happened because, with the shift of the farm complex, it's led to the preservation of all these areas.
Thanks. And
Oh.
were the DuPonts who built onto the place the same ones that did Longwood Gardens, that same DuPont family?
They did. That's the DuPonts of Longwood Gardens. No, I'm sorry, of Winter Tour. The Winter Tour is owned by I can't remember who owns Longwood, but because there's two DuPont families. There's one with a capital D. Ours is the lowercase d. So there's the movie Foxcatcher. Have you heard of Foxcatcher?
I haven't seen it. No.
It's a movie. It documents the life of the grandson of William DuPont, who goes a little crazy and ends up in jail. So, but those are the DuPonts that will live at Montpelier. So. Oh, cool. What artifacts are you most excited about finding? Do y'all have any ideas of what you might find?
We have no idea what we might find. We've made assumptions that we might find ceramics, but I have no idea.
Absolutely. We're locating units where the shovel test pits have located lots of ceramics. You can imagine a metal detector, you can't locate ceramics or glass with that. But you locate, buttons, you locate all sorts of nails, of course, but the shovel test bits are how we find the bone, the ceramic, and the glass. And so, yeah, there'll be all of that and more. And what's exciting is what I always love, you all are going to be opening the first units that have ever been opened up at this site. And so what's fun to do is to see what you're finding in the metal detector survey and in the shovel test bits and see how that shows up in a unit. So the unit you're going to be excavating, there's going to be a shovel test pit that was dug in the middle of it. You might be taking the sod off. This week has been a little busy. We had all the crew is heading to a conference tomorrow in Ocean City, and they'll be coming back on Sunday night. I've had to unfortunately stay behind because of a little bit of a family emergency that I've got going on. And but I'll be seeing you all on Sunday night for dinner. But yeah, no, lots of artifacts, ceramics, glass, that sort of thing. And certainly, I think looking through the booklet, that PDF booklet has some illustrations of some of these items. So, well, does anybody have any questions about what to bring? It looks like the weather is going to be pretty variable. And looking, I was just, when y'all were, we started out, I was looking at the temperatures, and it is ranging from like on Monday, Monday morning is gonna be 25 degrees out. And then it's gonna go up to 49 at the end of the day. And then by the middle of the week, the high temperature will be 67. So this rain is bringing in a bit of a cold front. So dress in layers, that's the most important thing. Yeah, you'll get warm as you go through the day. Bring your knee pad. Did you all get the list of items to bring?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yes.
That we've generated that list through the years of, what kind of the best hits are for people to bring. The visitor center won't be open. We'll be able to get in the visitor center all Tuesdays and Wednesdays. We've got the key. But you're going to want to pack your lunch, because there's no real food that's sold at the visitor center. Unfortunately, we had an amazing barbecue vendor at the visitor center up until COVID, and then after COVID, all that just died back. So we've not returned to that, unfortunately. So, but what I'll go ahead and do, I'll go ahead and I'm going to stop the recording